My name is Clifton Linden. I'm a data scientist, so this will be the driest 7 minutes of the Walrus talks. I work for a social enterprise called Vox Pop Labs, and we develop technologies that promote civic engagement and amplify public expression. The last time I was here in Prince Edward Island, I was 8 years old. Friends of my parents invited us to stay with them at their cottage in Fortune Bay, and my mother was determined that we make the great Canadian pilgrimage to Green Gables. It was my one and only childhood family trip, actually, and I remember seeing the ocean for the first time, plucking sand dollars from the shoreline, and driving all the way back to Ontario with a lobster trap tied to the top of our car. We loved that lobster trap. But I also remember fretting about the trip because it meant missing the last week of school. We were learning cursive handwriting, and there were still 2 or 3 letters left in the alphabet for which I hadn't learned the cursive form. And at the time, handwriting seemed so fundamental to the practice of social communication that I just couldn't imagine how I'd get by without it. Now, I did learn those last few letters on the back of a napkin somewhere, but little did I know that in my adult life, handwriting would become an artifact of a bygone era. It was giving way to the proliferation of keyboards, touchscreens, and other markers of the digital age. Now, swapping pen and paper for laptops and smartphones is not an apples-to-apples substitution. There was a pun in there, but none of you got it. It's deeply embedded. As Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan argued, the instruments we use to communicate shape the very fabric of our society. Digital technology has transformed the way we interpret and interact with each other and with the world around us. But in 1864, when the delegates of the Charlottetown Conference gathered just steps from here to lay the foundation for Confederation, they had about as much foresight into how digital technology would transform society as I did when I was here as a child. They could not have anticipated these new media, nor their potential to reimagine the way Canadian democracy operates. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was signed just as the first cohort of the millennial generation, myself included, was born, and well before the rise of online publishing, instant messaging, or social media. Although Canadian constitutional law subscribes to the living tree doctrine, which holds that the Constitution must be interpreted in keeping with the times, it's difficult to say whether the present architecture of our democracy has ever, in its 150-year history, been tested by a social transformation of this magnitude. And we are only at the beginning. We have yet to fully grasp how technologies such as artificial intelligence and virtual reality will shape society. It's not merely that society is changing that we have to take stock of, but rather the pace of that change. Futurist Ray Kurzweil argues that change is exponential, so we won't experience 100 years of progress in the 21st century. It will be more like 20,000 years of progress at today's rate. And so, I submit to you that we can no longer talk about our desires for a better country without considering the role that technology plays in furthering those desires. Now, there's a tension among philosophers as to whether technology shapes society or society shapes technology. The truth, I suspect, is somewhere in between. But to the extent that it's possible to steer technological innovation in a way that embodies our values and our ideals, we must all be active participants in how new technologies are adopted and integrated into the fabric of our society. Emergent technologies offer Canadians unprecedented opportunities to participate more substantively in our democracy. The digitization of data has increased the flow of and access to information, which has in turn fueled expectations of greater government accountability, transparency, and responsiveness. Social media has allowed average Canadians to move inward from the periphery of politics, from observer status to active influencers of government. But technology is not a panacea for all that ails our society. It's certainly not inevitable that technology will enhance or improve our democracy. Despite new opportunities and platforms for civic engagement, new technologies have hardly been the antidote to cynicism about government or the erosion of trust in our public institutions. If anything, they may be a cause. Political scientist Diana Mutz has found an inverse correlation between participatory democracy and deliberative democracy. Those of us who are more active participants in politics are typically less likely to engage in substantial deliberation with those who hold views that are contrary to our own. I'm sure there are exceptions in this room, and I applaud you. The more resolved we are in our opinions, the more we surround ourselves with like-minded people. Now, social media ostensibly exacerbates this phenomenon by isolating us from oppositional viewpoints. The core motivation of social media, after all, is shareability, not dialogue. And so these platforms tend to serve as content that we are likely to agree with and which reinforce our existing views. The medium, as per McLuhan's thesis, structures the way we engage with each other. This has arguably contributed to the increased polarization of political discourse in Canada and around the world by cutting off the legitimate exchange of ideas and views and by diminishing public discussion. Another, albeit perhaps related observation, is that we have more information available to us than at any point in human history, all of us. And yet we find ourselves in an era characterized as post-truth, in which alternative facts compete with empirical evidence. Digital technology has muddled the media landscape, with purveyors of misinformation disguising themselves as sources of journalism. So while technological advancements hold great promise for our democracy, they also present some of its most salient threats. If we are indeed to leverage technology as part of our desire to build a better country, we must ourselves be agents in shaping the way that technology is taken up in our society. We must be vigilant about which platforms we legitimize by way of our online activity. We must seek out and support sources of journalism that are motivated by a desire to inform, ahead of any incentives around shareability. We must foster online exchanges that encourage dialogue, not exacerbate division. We must ensure that every Canadian has a voice online so that they can have a voice offline. Finally, we must demand that technologies at the center of this new era of democratic participation are accessible and inclusive, so as not to further exacerbate existing disparities in our society, but instead seek to close the gap. But the onus is on us, both as Canadians and citizens of the world, to shape these technologies to that end. Thank you.